A warm handshake after the Doklam diffusion as Prime Minister Narendra Modi met his Chinese counterpart at the BRICS summit in Xiamen. Good evening and welcome to this special show. A big diplomatic victory for India at the BRICS summit. Over the next 30 minutes, we will discuss the big talking points from the Xiamen declaration. Joining me live from Xiamen is our very own Zaka Jacob. And joining us now to discuss this further, a former Foreign Secretary, Kanwal Sibal, and former Ambassador K.C. Singh. We're also joined by Ram Upendra Das. He heads the Center for Regional Trade, which comes under the Commerce Department. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Thank you very much all for being here. Zaka, let me come straight to you first. As you see it from there, what are the top 5 headlines from the declaration which was put out a couple hours earlier?
Well, there are 5 big takeaways. The first, of course, and topmost certainly, is the fact that for the very first time in a BRICS declaration, a joint declaration, Pakistan-based terror outfits like the Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed have been named, explicitly named. India had been trying to do the same in last year's summit, which was hosted in Goa, but unsuccessfully. In the space of a year, they've managed to convince the Chinese and explicitly got the mention of both Lashkar and Jaish in that document. Number 2, within the space of a week, last Monday, exactly a week ago, we had the Doklam resolution, and now we have this joint declaration in Xiamen. So it's been 2 big successes for Indian diplomacy when it comes to dealing with difficult issues vis-a-vis China. So is this perhaps the start of a new modus vivendi with China? Number 3, there was a memorandum today that was signed by all 5 countries, which establishes a new credit ratings agency for BRICS members. Now, China particularly has had issues with the existing credit rating agencies, whether it's S&P, Fitch and Moody's, and they've always articulated that they want a new credit ratings agency that will reflect a new world order. India has also asked for predictability in global nuclear trade and commerce, i.e. China imposing conditions and obstacles in the way of India getting full membership to the nuclear suppliers group. And finally, on North Korea, which of course had a huge bearing on how global markets perform today, the joint declaration basically calls for direct negotiations between all parties concerned. In this instance, I think it's the Chinese way of telling the United States that if you want to solve the North Korea problem, you can't put all the onus on us. You've got to install some kind of direct dialogue with Pyongyang. So these were the 5 big takeaways, but certainly the most important one was on the issue of terror, where it's been a big point that's been scored by not just Indian diplomats, but also certainly by Mr. Modi, because at every global fora he's been hammering away at this point about the world's double standards when it comes to global terrorism and terrorism that emanates from Pakistan. So the fact that groups like Lashkar and Jaish have been explicitly mentioned is a big takeaway.
Zaka, for the uninitiated, I mean, like me, and maybe some of our viewers as well, the naming of these 2 groups, I mean, what really is the significance? I mean, because China itself has been pretty tough on terror groups, and it has had trouble with terror groups in some parts of that country.
That's right, and one of those is called the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which is also one of the terror groups that's mentioned today, along with the Lashkar and Jaish. So it mentions different terror groups that target different members in the BRICS grouping. So there's been a bit of a trade-off there. But I think why this is important is because this helps put pressure on Pakistan. Now, at all global fora, including most notably at the United Nations Security Council and the Sanctions Committee 1267, for the last year and a half now, the Chinese have basically put on technical hold this resolution, which was last year moved by India to proscribe the Jaish-e-Mohammed chief Masood Azhar as a globally designated terrorist. They put that on technical hold twice. Eventually, that resolution expired at the end of 2016. And again, this year, there was a fresh resolution asking for the same demand, which was brought forth by the United States. It was co-sponsored by the UK and France. That too has been put on technical hold. Now, the real proof of the pudding will be when next month, at the end of October, when this resolution comes up for review, If the Chinese stick to this technical hold stand of theirs, then you can look back and look at the Xiamen Declaration and say it was of no use, it was merely rhetoric coming from the Chinese side, it was mere words, it didn't necessarily change their action. But if they do give in on that technical hold, I think today would have been a sort of a harbinger of things to come.
Okay, that's very interesting, and we will take this up with our guests. But before I do that, let me just quickly run you through what to me stood out as far as the highlights of some of the trade-related aspects of the declaration which was put out. And I'm going to list just 4 or 5. I mean, so number one really has been the fact that the declaration says that they firmly oppose any sort of protectionism. I mean, actually, they go on to highlight that they are very committed to asking for some of the repeal of some of the protectionist measures which we've seen, especially from some countries out there in the West. The declaration talks about facilitating financial market integration. I mean, they go into a little bit of detail. One of the aspects there, of course, is currency cooperation, currency swaps, etc. We saw this being sort of working during the 2008 financial crisis. But I mean, at that point, the big focus, of course, was on some of the more affected Western countries. And it kind of sort of also talks about enhancing anti-corruption cooperation, taking to task money laundering and illicit flow of funds between countries in the agreement. So, I mean, these are some of the economy-related highlights, but I think the bulk of the heavy lifting, really, I mean, if you wanted to really put out the highlights of this one, it says Zaka mentioned some of the points that he really mentioned. On the diplomatic front, I think there are clear highlights. Okay, let's bring in our guests. We have Mr. K.C. Singh, former diplomat. We have Kawal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary. Ram Upinder Das is head of Center for Regional Trade at the Department of Commerce. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Zaka, of course, is also with us. He joins the discussion. Mr. Singh, if you have had time to go through the declaration, what to your mind are really the highlights? What really stands out?
Before I come to Zaka's 2-3 points, I think something on which all the countries are in agreement is an overhaul of the international financial system, which is IMF and the voting rights. On that, there is no disagreement. On other things, there may be overlaps and so on and so forth. Coming to Zaka's point, I would not go all the way and say just because Jaish-e-Mohammed is mentioned, Chinese have climbed down, because remember, Jaish-e-Mohammed itself is banned by Pakistan since 2002, as is Lashkar-e-Taiba. So their listing of organizations, Pakistan doesn't have a serious objection because organizations just change their names. But naming individuals is where the problem arises. Now, will Chinese take the next step and not object to Masood Azhar? It needs to be tested. We don't know. Similarly, with the nuclear suppliers group, we already have a waiver. Therefore, in a resolution, in a declaration like this to say India should have access to nuclear technology, we don't need Chinese permission for that. We already have a waiver from NSG. But the question is, will they stop objecting to Indian membership or come there with Pakistan tied to their leg and half a dozen objections? Now, the other thing is that, you know, in a sense, India's for getting what we wanted, we've had to compromise on some of the positions because I think this is a kind of a non-aligned countries kind of resolution which we used to go in for, slightly anti-West. Now, if you come to Korea, it's essentially the Chinese and the Russian position. They're not calling upon North Korea to stop, roll back, stop testing, nothing of the kind. They are saying, please come and talk to them. Now, what does that mean? That's really a very, very soft and easy line on North Korea. It's not the kind of line that we will take when Abe is here or we'll take when we are with the Americans. But I would imagine when you are in the BRICS, you behave somewhat differently from when you are in another company. So we'll have to be selective as we go along. But some of that language is not particularly in line with how we would approach those subjects. But overall, yes. And then you take ICT, international internet communication technologies. Now here is a country, Russia, which is being looked at by Americans as having hacked the computers there and interfered with the US election, and they're calling for, you know, international supervision. Chinese who don't give free access to their own citizens, they're talking of this control moving to some international body. Now, we've joined it as a general rule, we've joined it, but I don't think anybody seriously thinks this is ever going to be allowed, or it really would in any way help India. You don't want control to go into, say, the hands of Security Council kind of organization which will then stall whatever is being done, essentially kill the ICT, because Chinese are using it very selectively. So, and let me finally say, it's very interesting, they talk of democracy and rule of law when it comes to international relations, but they are not subscribing. Chinese and the Russians are not for democracy and international law as far as their domestic behavior or even the Chinese behavior in South China Sea is concerned. So all this will go on. There's a long winding resolution, but you know, you can take bits and pieces of it and use it.
Let me go across to Foreign Secretary Kanwal Sibal and ask him, leave aside, we here in the media are perhaps making a big deal of the fact that Jaish and Lashkar have been named explicitly for the first time in a BRICS joint declaration. Leave that aside. I'm just curious about how in the space of a week, exactly last Monday you had the Doklam resolution, and there again it seemed like India and India's point of view prevailed. And today we've had the joint declaration where something that India had been arguing for a very long time, certainly from the Goa BRICS summit last year, the explicit mention of Pakistan-based terror groups has found a great deal of mention in today's joint declaration. How in the space of a week has Indian diplomacy managed to get these two significant victories, if I can use that phrase?
Well, there's clearly a climb down on the part of China. If you recall, their foreign minister just a couple of days ago, their foreign ministry spokesman just a couple of days ago, actually warned India in advance not to raise the terrorism issue. Recognizing India's concerns on terrorism relating to Pakistan, they said this would not be an appropriate subject for discussion at the Xiamen summit. Now, which means that until a couple of days ago, the Chinese were not very clear in their mind as to what position they should take, and it was a very arrogant demand on their part that they should try and counsel the Indian Prime Minister to go by their wishes with regard to what points he would like to raise at this summit. Now, if you see actually the text on terrorism is a very elaborate text, far more elaborate than the one issued at Goa. And at Goa, they mentioned other terrorist organizations, but refused to mention Pakistan-based terrorist organizations, which they have done. Now, I think Pakistan would get very concerned about this because this is coming on the heels of President Trump's Afghan-Pak review and summoning Pakistan to cease giving safe havens to these agents of chaos, etc., etc. And they would feel concerned that it would seem that China's support on this issue is getting weakened. Now, the other important thing is that even Russia has been resistant to any formulations that would indirectly mention Pakistan or Pakistan-based terrorist groups, and at Goa they did not support us. But this time, both China and Russia have gone along with Indian demands, and this is a significant step forward diplomatically and in terms of the signals it sends to Pakistan. Now, I quite expect that China will separately, bilaterally give Pakistan all kinds of assurances and perhaps issue some kind of a statement in some context, once again lauding their role as a frontline state against terrorism. So I don't see China backing off on the issue of protecting Pakistan on the issue of terrorism, though they have weakened their own position within the relevant UN Security Council committee by opposing the designation of Masood Azhar as an international terrorist, because India would be in a position to cite this BRICS declaration mentioning this organization. So to that extent, India has clearly succeeded in getting its views expressed in the joint statement, and it certainly goes to the credit of Indian diplomacy that they've done this. And I think finally, China wanted the whole Xiamen summit to proceed smoothly and undo some of the damage that has been done to the bilateral India-China relationship because of Doklam, lower temperatures and tensions, and now present a sweet face, relatively sweet face, to us to prevent further downfall of relations. But we should not take that too seriously, because the basic differences, strategic differences between India and China will remain and will not get resolved so easily.
Okay, fair enough. Mr. Das, if I can come to you next. the Chinese economy is essentially bigger, much bigger than the rest of the BRICS members combined. It has been that way for a while. So it kind of dominates BRICS completely, economically speaking. So just comment on what you heard the other panelists say in terms of, at least some, optically, we've seemed to have scored some diplomatic victories. If China dominates the grouping, the BRICS grouping, like the way it does, what implications does that have and to help us sort of understand what's going on?
Well, if I just focus purely on the economic side of the declaration, you would have to appreciate that BRICS economies are very heterogeneous in terms of their economic structures as well as their economic performance, especially in recent times. And if that is the context, the elements that you also mentioned and your colleague from China mentioned, and also other panelists, they point towards convergence. We are all aware that there are divergences of opinion on various issues, but if you see the declaration, it does show convergence on various issues where each leader's concerns as well as aspirations for future of this grouping actually is reflected. Second element of this declaration is that it is very comprehensive. I quite find it a mini G20 declaration. And this is a good omen in the sense that there is now going to be a mutually reinforcing process between G20 and BRICS, where if things converge in BRICS, that can actually get reflected in G20 because of the fact, again, you mentioned, on some of the issues that relate to global economic governance. It could relate to global financial institutions, IMF, World Bank. It can relate to the, the NDB and the IIB and the contingent reserve arrangement that they have. And now they have stretched it further to going for local currency bond markets and also creating a fund in local currency. Now, these are very significant. Now, when you come to WTO, and we are going to have the next ministerial in Argentina, again, the leaders have unanimously called for, addressing standstill and rollback as far as the liberal economic policies that relate to trade and other related issues. So in my view, given the context of heterogeneity in terms of the economic prowess that you asked, as well as the structures and performance, this is a comprehensive and a converging document as I see.
Okay, so maybe the way to look at this entire thing is that, both India and China believe that the size of the opportunity is much larger for that to be sidetracked by, shaky bilateral relations, to put it one way. But we will take a very quick break here. Zaka is with us, our guest panel is with us as well. We will see you on the other side in 2 minutes. We continue this discussion.